What does it mean to be famous? It's a question always in the back of my mind. We see it every single day in our modern society. The brands, the people, the wealth, the stakes. We look upon these human constructs and say to ourselves, that's what fame looks like. To be iconic. To be looked upon with content and the fiending eyes of general audiences. You see, the weird thing about fame is that something doesn't have to be objectively good to achieve this feat, because most people don't even know what's good for themselves. As long as you have something that satisfies a want, a psychological desire for satisfaction and contempt, there's always an audience to be had, no matter the actual value brought to the table. And no one knows this more than a little-known Japanese video game company we call Nintendo. No entity can do more with less than the people who make Mario. Their products are almost never the most technologically advanced or powerful on the market at any given point in time, and yet they continue to sell, and sell well at that. Even what's considered their failures still sell upwards of millions of units and provide unique experiences that engage audiences. Former president of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, coined the marketing term Blue Ocean strategy to describe how Nintendo's approach to the gaming industry works. Whereas the competition drives innovation and sales through purely technological means, like graphics, resolutions, and chipsets, the stuff only the most hardcore gaming class pays attention to, Nintendo likes to think outside the box. They put less focus on this side and instead tap into the markets that aren't getting a morsel of consideration otherwise, what Reggie calls the blue oceans. This could be through appealing and intuitive features that competitors wouldn't risk trying, or gaming experiences that put accessibility at the forefront rather than fancy graphics and stories. This strategy has been the centerpiece to their throne in pop culture since we measured hardware in bits. As much as it's hard to admit for the elite gaming class, the average consumer isn't going to care how many teraflops the next PlayStation has, or what resolution the new Xbox can output. All they care about is if Tetris can be played in the car on their Game Boy, or that Grandpa can golf just how he remembers on the Wii, or even be able to bring a home experience with you on the go. None of these consoles are even remotely the most advanced or powerful of their generation, but you wouldn't know it if you looked at the sales numbers. Those experiences matter, and it's what makes people, no matter how much they consider themselves gamers, come back time and time again for the big N. And that's what makes Nintendo famous. But to be famous, you must learn to not be infamous. To be infamous doesn't necessarily mean to be bad. After all, no one is absolutely perfect at everything and anything. No, to be infamous requires a whole other level of mismanagement, incompetence, and failure when you aren't just known, you're negatively known. To be a laughingstock, a story that will be told in the Hall of Shame rather than the Hall of Fame. You probably know exactly where I'm going with this. Because if there's one truly infamous corner of Nintendo's history they want to bury, it all starts when an infamous pair of red goggles graced our Earth for the very first time. Red is the color of bloodshed, an effect that would most accurately describe its lifespan, with unreleased games, low sales, and even potential health risks. Need I say more? This is the lost legend of one virtual boy.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
The word virtual means something that is in essence, or in fact, but not completely within capability. The word has been in use since at least the Renaissance period, oftentimes describing famed European artists of the era using the depth technique of perspective, tricking the human mind into believing something is there when in reality, the effect only exists in ethos. Even after the days of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, this word would continue to intrigue humanity in its description. In 1832, English scientist Sir Charles Wheatstone would create the very first stereoscope, a tool which could project the illusion of depth through a binocular device. This fangled new invention worked through sets of mirrors creating two separate images that could be seen through each of your eyes, tricking your brain into seeing a full three-dimensional object from a simple flat image. The device was quite ahead of its time, even predating modern photography, and would start a new perception of reality as we knew it. They say seeing is believing, but now our very own perception could easily be challenged with a glorified pair of binoculars, and needless to say, people were intrigued. Throughout the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century, the devices became more portable, streamlined, and advanced. But a new invention would soon dawn upon the virtual landscape forever: the computer. Now, the possibilities for stereoscopic technology were more than just a piece of film or a simple sheet of paper. They could potentially be expanded to anything and everything capable by a digital machine. But it would need a sleeker, more science fiction-esque name to fit this expansive new reality. A virtual reality, perhaps. What many would consider to be the first head-mounted virtual reality device as we knew it would be created by computer scientist Ivan Sutherland with the help of his students at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory. Nicknamed the Sword of Damocles, it combined a head-mounted display with tracking technology to create a fully immersive experience, despite its basic UI and wireframe graphics. Soon enough, this experiment would create another space race. That is, a race within the virtual space. NASA would be the first to join in the fun in 1978 by creating a virtual tour of Aspen, Colorado. A simple feat, but one that could be expanded into more humble purposes, such as astronaut training and mission preparation. But when one entity sees a tool, another sees treasure. At this point, virtual reality technology was mostly confined to the walls of big research institutions and government-funded mega agencies. But it was starting to advance to the point that dreams of headsets being home entertainment staples along the television and radio could start becoming reality. By the 1980s, it wasn't just NASA or MIT or ARPA or any other prestigious acronym that was interested, it was household brands you probably recognize. And this is where we meet a man named Alan Becker. In 1985, a nerdy-looking dude by the name of Al Becker had a novel but insurmountable idea on his hands. He thought to himself, what if we created a head-mounted computer that had a small, sharp, high-resolution display that was compact and versatile? Certainly an ahead-of-its-time concept, one that Becker would need a lot of dedication and funding to get off the ground. So, a year later, ground broke on his new company based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Reflection Technologies Incorporated, and he would quickly get to work with his team. First on the docket was the issue of the display itself. Traditional CRT technology was too clunky and power-hungry for a portable device, and other mobile machines of the era, such as laptops, provided grody, monochrome screens with murky hues and poor light adaptation. This left only those pesky light-emitting diodes as an option, which were cheap, portable, and plentiful. Using inspiration from a reading machine for the blind he helped develop, Becker would come up with a process where a line of LEDs would be reflected onto your retinas using a mirror that would move around at 50 times a second, creating a high-resolution moving image. It would be decided to use red LEDs for the process, as they were by far the cheapest and most advanced of diodes out there. The final product was an inch-long device that you looked through to see a private, stereoscopic image projected 1.5 feet away. With 6 months, thousands in funding, and humble operations out of a bakery, the team would create a prototype of their linear array system called the Private Eye. But soon enough, their little project would be far more than private. The technology would quickly be floated around to different industries, with medical, military, business, and entertainment applications in mind, all featuring varying levels of success in adapting the Private Eye. While the project was easy to sell at first considering it was hyped up as the sparkling new future of wearable computing, in the end, most companies didn't go beyond the pilot stage. They needed a killer app, a truly major sell that could be developed into a golden goose. And that's where video games come in. By the dawn of the 1990s, the term virtual reality hadn't failed to penetrate the brains of the average consumer. It was marketed as the bright and technologically advanced world that dreams were made of. Movies such as The Wizard and The Lawnmower Man portrayed a world where you could become one with the virtual reality of the future. While these works were purely science fiction, it was becoming more and more clear that with more R&D, they could become science fact. So when Reflection saw this video game thing that everyone seemed to be playing these days, it only seemed as the most logical path to take to put their revolutionary product to market. Engineers quickly put together a demo of a head-tracked, first-person tank game running on the Private Eye as a means of pitching the device to potential buyers. first, it was shown to toy companies such as Mattel and Hasbro, but there was no such luck. Then they went to Sega, seemingly the most trendy and fashionable video game manufacturer of the era, who also shot it down. Most of the concern expressed about the private eye was that the device could cause motion sickness to its viewers, something even modern VR headsets have a problem with. Former president of Sega of America, Tom Kalinske, stated that kids testing the device felt sick, threw up, or fell over, something that you probably don't want for your image. But then, a lead from Reflection's Japanese liaison. It turns out one video game behemoth over there was interested in the device, and as a result, so was RTI. At this point, Nintendo had dominated every facet of the video game industry. They had single-handedly saved the North American video game market with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, and they weren't doing too shabby in their home country either. They were losing ground to Sega rapidly, sure, but for the time being, they still claimed the throne. So as to get ahead of the curve, they looked into something that their main competitor had staunchly rejected. More specifically, the general manager of Nintendo's R&D 1 division, Gunpei Yokoi, did. Yokoi had been with the company before video games were even a glimmer in their eye, and helped develop two previous successes in the Game & Watch and Game Boy, hardware that would go on to revolutionize portable computing. It's interesting to note that Yokoi was actually considering retiring, as he felt he was being left behind in the arms race of the console wars. He wanted to be out of the big end by the age of 50 to sit back and potentially carve a path in the industry on his own accord. But after being impressed by the tank demo, Yokoi immediately changed course to help develop the technology, now codenamed VR32. Weirdly enough, this wasn't even Nintendo's first time developing a pair of stereoscopic glasses. In 1987, they would release the Famicom 3D system, an accessory from the family computer that, with a compatible game, could produce a stereoscopic effect. It was a massive failure and never released outside Japan. Even with this previous history in mind, President Hiroshi Yamauchi was also quite impressed and allowed the project to have top engineers at their disposal. Together, Nintendo and Reflection could do great things. Originally, the engineers wanted to stick to the end goal of creating a pair of goggles you could put on your face and move around with, incorporated with head tracking in those cheap red and black graphics Reflection developed. But there were some problems with making it wearable. Some bigwigs in the legal department were initially worried people could injure themselves since they were literally walking around in a virtual pitch-black void. A fair point for sure, but even this could be the least of their problems. Because of the chipset they used, a low-power 32-bit architecture with graphical assistance, it could potentially produce EMF radiation that engineers were worried could fry your brain. Not exactly a good thing for a device you put as close to your face as humanly possible. To combat this, a large metal plate had to be put over the inner workings of the goggles, but this caused the device to become too bulky to wear for extended periods of time. And so, a tough decision had to be made. The device would be restricted to a two-legged tabletop form where instead of being attached to your head, you had to awkwardly hunch over to stare into the device's lenses. Once again, their true intent had to be handicapped for the sake of humanity. But at least they had the 3D to fall back on, right? After all, 3D was such a big buzzword in the 1990s that having that alone could make units fly off the shelves. Yeah, not exactly. You see, while the VR32 was designed as a 32-bit console, roughly on the level of the Super Effects chip of the Super Nintendo or 32X of the Genesis, the retina-burning parallax pixels only allowed for the most basic of wireframe graphics and layered 2D sprites. During development, they did experiment with more powerful chipsets and full-color screens, but they did not produce good results and would have made the console far more expensive and far more risky. Once again, visions are limited literally and figuratively to cut expenses. It's almost like this wasn't a good idea to begin with. Now all we were left with was a clunky, bipedal, battery-powered pair of unwearable goggles that you awkwardly gazed into to maybe kinda sorta give yourself brain damage. The thing was a giant mess, and there were calls both in and outside the company to shelve the project altogether. An eye institute hired by Nintendo stated the console might be safe, but could cause conditions in younger children such as lazy eye. The legal department was still calling to slap a boatload of warnings on the box in compliance with Japanese law, something that would make the public even more apprehensive about the device. The manual was filled with more don'ts than hows. Oh yeah, not to mention the game development team was shafted aside as many of Nintendo's top designers were busy working on this Ultra 64 thing. Sure, it wasn't a complete afterthought, they'd still poured tons of funding, development, and manpower into the device. But let's just say when you don't have Miyamoto on your side, you're probably screwed. Yet Yokoi was still adamant that this would be their fourth true console, alongside the Famicom, Super Famicom, and Game Boy. Time was ticking, and they would need to get a presentable product out in time to be revealed at the 1994 Shoshinkai Software Exhibition. Nintendo would need to get dressed for the date, but instead they would show up with uncombed hair, an old suit, and a rancid smell. But come on, none of that matters anyway. As long as people hear virtual reality and 3D in the same sentence, that will surely turn heads. Are you ready, kids? Because this is Virtual Boy. Making its debut at Shoshinkai 94, the newly named Virtual Boy surely turned heads, but not in the way Nintendo could have hoped. Early rumors about the console were promising, so it was a shock to many what the product ended up being like hands-on. It seemed that many of the cut corners would come back to haunt the developers, as their little boy was panned for its awkward bipod and lackluster, eye-piercing, bright red graphics. Not to mention the lack of any of the franchises that made Nintendo, well, Nintendo. During development, Yokoi was told by Yamamuchi that his console would put less emphasis on franchises like Mario, as to not take away eyes from the game that would become Super Mario 64. It was clear right then and there Yokoi would have to turn to cheap alternatives. Instead of Mario, you get such killer apps as Space Pinball and Driving Demo. Some real legendary system sellers for those of you not in the know. Even when Mario did appear, it was usually in an unplayable demo or in a token spin-off game like Tennis. Reflection could only watch as their technology was vandalized and mutilated with unimpressive appeal on both the hardware and software side. These same sentiments were echoed when the console made its North American debut at CES and E3 the next year. Even with all the mismanagement, cut corners, and poor public perception that persisted throughout its development, Nintendo still had high hopes, projecting 3 million units to sell within the first year of its release. In fact, most big media outlets still had high hopes. Come on guys, this was Nintendo. They hadn't failed to deliver before, and they certainly won't fail to deliver now. If they iron out the kinks, we could be in for the next video gaming revolution. I guess all we could do as a collective was wait for the Red Scare to be unleashed onto an unsuspecting world. With press-fueled hype and $25 million in marketing behind its back, the Virtual Boy was officially released in Japan on July 21st, 1995, and in North America on August 14th. But no one lined up in the streets to get one at launch. No one fought over the console in the alley behind Kmart because little Timmy wanted it for Christmas. In fact, there was little to no fanfare about the Virtual Boy, if any, at all. What a surprise. But why was this? There are 3 reasons I want to highlight that would eventually lead to the catastrophic failure of the Virtual Boy as a whole. The first starts with the most eye-catching thing people saw when finding it collecting dust on a store shelf: the price tag. A Virtual Boy console at launch retailed for $179.95 in Freedom Bucks, about $360 in 2024 money. For reference, you could get a Game Boy bundled with Tetris for around $60 and have infinitely more fun. Nintendo seemed to have caught on to this even before the console was released, as it was initially announced to be around $200. Over the console's short life, the price was subsequently dropped to $180, to $160, to $99, and eventually ending up in the bargain bins of Toys R Us for less than $30. A sad fate for any console, especially one made by the prestigious Nintendo. Secondly, there were the health risks. A pretty obvious one if you've watched through this entire adventure. Even if there was little evidence that the console really messed with your vision, there just wasn't enough to say that wasn't the case. The Japanese press would continue to dogpile Nintendo about the potential vision issues that may result from playing the Virtual Boy, even before the console was released. Then came the rumors of brain damage and adverse health effects. Regardless of how true these claims really were, it not only made the public weary, but also Nintendo's legal department. In an era where video games were still seen as tools to corrupt the minds of the youth, the Virtual Boy only made things worse. Now, this fear-mongering wasn't as rampant stateside, but even then common sense told people that staring into a black void with bright red lights coming at your retinas didn't sound like the most fun of times. Bill Friesling of the Washington Post complained of dizziness, nausea, and headaches after using the system. Some scientists even published articles that headsets like the Virtual Boy could cause severe and long-term health effects. I'll say it once and I'll say it again, it's almost like this wasn't a great idea to begin with. After the console launched, Nintendo would make a deal with Blockbuster for people to rent out the console for $10 a pop, and upon returning the unit you would regain your investment by getting a $10 coupon for its purchase from any store. This was supposed to drive home how advanced the console was, but in reality it only drove people mad. Once they saw how bad the graphics truly were, they returned it almost instantly and didn't make use of their deal. All of this, the warnings on every facet of the device, the scary graphics, and most of all, the prevailing fear, definitely prevented units from being shipped. But there's another, more straightforward reason for why the Virtual Boy failed, because this was a video game console after all. And what's the main thing you do on a video game console? Play games. Games that the Virtual Boy lacked in quantity and quality. At the system's launch, there were 4 games available, and none of them were what you would consider system sellers. Mario's Tennis, the console's pack-in game and the only appearance of Nintendo's famed plumber at launch. Red Alarm, a simple shoot-'em-up game that was supposed to take full advantage of the console's graphical capabilities. Tellero Boxer, a first-person boxing game. And finally, Galactic Pinball, Gunpei Yokoi's initial pet project and what would become of Space Pinball. A meager lineup for sure, but this was just the beginning, for you see there were more games to come in the future. 22 games. 22 games would come to fruition throughout the Virtual Boy's short life. Mainline franchises went from lacking before release to almost completely non-existent afterward. No Zelda, no Kirby, and the only glimpse of Mario was Tennis and Mario Clash, which was just a 3D rendition of the arcade Mario Bros. Well, that was aside from one outlier that I'll get to in a minute. There were a few sports games, baseball, bowling, golf, and fishing all made appearances on the console. Even Space Invaders had an official, Japanese-only compilation of the first 2 arcade games. But where the Virtual Boy quote-unquote shined is in its abundance of puzzle and strategy games. It's easy to see why games like Tetris and Bomberman are known for their ability to be played on anything and everything under the sun. They are some of the few major franchises that had some sort of presence. Otherwise, not many games are just all that notable. Many didn't even come out in both regions that the console was released, it was usually just one or the other. And that's not even mentioning the boatloads of games that were planned but never released. This is usually the part of the video where I put in some cheeky, silent film inspired part about the Virtual Boy's cancelled games, but I have plans I'll save for later. Yet there's one game that stands above all the others. A golden treasure atop the landfill of garbage. While the Virtual Boy may have been lacking in Mario titles, you better turn that M upside down, because it's Wario time, baby! Virtual Boy Wario Land. Probably the only game in this adventure that has a legacy outside of being released on the Red Menace. It revolves around Wario going out and searching for treasure, all while escaping from a cave he fell in while digging around in the rainforest. Combining platforming and collectathon elements, the game actually made good use of the parallax capabilities by allowing Wario to jump in between the background and foreground. It's surprisingly good, and is by far the best reviewed game on the system. Games like Donkey Kong Country Returns, Mutant Mudds, and even Mario Wonder would take inspiration from VB Wario Land's background gimmick. Truly a standout game in the sea of sadness. Unfortunately, it didn't matter. These 3 reasons, price, health risks, and games, all combined to completely tank the Virtual Boy's sales. The high hopes and projections at Nintendo and Reflection withered away with little fanfare. By the end of 1995, the console had only sold 140,000 units in Japan. This seemed to be the final straw for Hiroshi Yamauchi, as he would officially pull the plug and discontinue the console in Japan on December 22nd, 1995. The Virtual Boy did fare slightly better in North America, but demand completely diminished by 1996, and the price just kept getting cut lower and lower until slowly fading into the background. Nintendo had bigger and better plans anyways. The Virtual Boy was officially put out of its misery in August of 1996, cementing its legacy as a dumpster fire no one noticed aside from those who started it. After being completely discontinued just a year after release, the final sales figures certainly jumped out on paper, but not exactly how Nintendo had hoped. Remember, they had expected 3 million consoles to be sold within the first 365 days after launch. 770,000. Need I say more? That's just 26% of what was projected to be sold. That's just 6% of what the Wii U sold across its entire lifetime. And let's just say that wasn't exactly Nintendo's most successful console either. But at least they let that creature stick around for its full lifespan. The Virtual Boy just never had that luxury. It was a product so flawed in its design and purpose that it could not possibly continue living. And just like that, it was gone. Many people were quick to point fingers. Some pointed at Reflection and Alan Becker, who were surprised themselves to see the Virtual Boy fall as it did. They were the driving force behind its poorly executed technology after all. Some pointed at the marketing and legal departments, who made the console look like an evil beast in the eyes of consumers. But most pointed towards the creator, the visionary behind this mess, Nintendo's very own Gunpei Yokoi. He had come from the brink of retirement just to see his Virtual Boy grow up into a virtual man, and stood behind him at every facet. Clearly, he was the one to point and laugh at, right? At least, that's what you would think, because no one at the big end seemed to be upset or angry at him. When the time came for Yokoi to hand in his resignation papers on August 16th, 1996, most mourned the end to an illustrious career at Nintendo. He had spent 31 years developing some of the greatest and most memorable products the company would sell. One failure would not change that fact. Yamauchi didn't directly blame Yokoi for anything, and neither did Chairman of Nintendo of America, Howard Lincoln. He thought, if anything, Yokoi left in deep regret. It can be really easy to blame the failure, the dumpster fire, and the infamy of something on just one person. But the truth is that one person did not create the Virtual Boy. Many people, many entities, and many corporations did. Like most failures, it was a team effort done with good intent, only for it to completely blow up in their faces. Most would learn to move on from the Virtual Boy, but not without the scars of the past. Nintendo, being a multi-billion-dollar behemoth, absorbed the losses and continued to be the video game giant they were before. But Reflection, a smaller startup, would be financially battered and struggled to get anything else with the private eye technology off the ground. Al Becker would move on, but would pass away unexpectedly from a ruptured artery in 2001. He was just 53 years old. Yokoi, looking to bounce back from the failure, started his own company, Koto Laboratory, with a former colleague of his. He would go on to develop a handheld that would later become the Wonder Swan, a Japan-only console released by Bandai in 1999. It actually held its own in the market against Nintendo for a while, but unfortunately, Yokoi would not live to see its legacy play out. On October 4th, 1997, he was involved in a minor traffic collision on an expressway 200 miles north of Tokyo. After getting out of the car, he was struck by another moving vehicle and died due to his injuries at the age of 56. A tragic and cold end to an incredibly influential man and one infamous video game console. But what does it mean to be infamous? We all have that point in our lives where we want to create something that will change the world or redefine the standard. In other words, to be famous. Many succeed, but using that logic means that many will also fail. For every Tom Brady, there's a Ryan Leaf. For every iPhone, there's a Windows Phone. And for every great Nintendo success story, there's a little red pair of goggles blinding anyone in its path. The Virtual Boy is infamous. It was a critical and commercial failure to its very definition. If it wasn't, this would be a completely different story. But there's a reason why we know these names and faces by heart. After all, why does Nintendo feel the need to sarcastically reference the Virtual Boy in many of their future games and projects? Hell, why was there a need for Nintendo to create another console using stereoscopic 3D technology? Well, I guess you could say the devil is in the details. Stories like the Virtual Boy come around to remind us that you can have the biggest name, the best engineer, and the greatest visionary in the game, and still fall flat on your face. The people behind the hardware weren't looking to create the monster that would end up gracing store shelves. They were just people with a grand passion, a passion that was far too experimental and far too ahead of its time to really go anywhere. But I think there's a far more mundane reason for why the Virtual Boy is infamous. Nintendo surfed the blue oceans a little too hard. During development, they tried to find a gimmick that everyone could latch onto and enjoy, something that their competitors hadn't risked trying in the pursuit of power and increasing that number of bits. But in this thinking, Nintendo had forgotten common sense. They should have thought to themselves that maybe there's a good reason our competition passed up this opportunity. But by then it was too late. The Virtual Boy would hit the market full speed ahead, only to be panned and laughed at until the end of time. Because to surf the blue oceans requires an immense amount of skill and swiftness, where the line between outstanding success and commercial failure becomes finer. It would really only take a true innovator like Reggie to perfect this formula later on. So, to answer the question that has been looming over our heads, what does it mean to be infamous? To be infamous requires you to be famous. To be talked about, to be looked at under a microscope for all of eternity. This is the tale spoken by one video game console, one red menace, one commercial failure, one big, bad Virtual Boy who cried wolf. This has been BrayBray, thanks for watching, and remember that Buff Yoshi is forever supreme.
Ah, but is he though? For you see, he made us wait all this time for a new upload, only for it to be not lost media related in the slightest. Might as well turn The Simpsons green, because this channel is really on a downward spiral if I do say so myself.
Ah, I see the people have spoken. Yeah, remember earlier when I was talking about the unreleased games for the Virtual Boy and teased that I had plans for later? Well, you're in luck. The next BrayBray production will be a lost media video about just that. Hopefully you won't have to wait 2 months to see it either. Stay tuned, and make sure to subscribe. I don't know how to end this, so I guess Skibbity Toilet Ohio Riz iPad. If that doesn't make you subscribe, I don't know what will.